The bell above the diner door jingled, but nobody looked up from their greasy plates until the crying started. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, wearing a filthy, oversized t-shirt, his left arm hanging at a sickening, unnatural angle. He walked right past the uniformed sheriff sipping coffee at the counter, past the gasping waitresses, and stopped dead in front of the most dangerous man in the room, a 6'4" Hell's Angel wearing full club colors. The giant biker looked down, his scarred face unreadable. The diner went completely dead silent. The boy wiped a bloody nose, looked the terrifying outlaw dead in the eye, and whispered, "He broke my arm." What the biker did next would defy every law, shock the entire town, and make national headlines. The oppressive, suffocating heat of Bakersfield, California, had a way of melting the life out of everything it touched. It was mid-August, the kind of day where the asphalt rippled like dark water and the air tasted like dust and exhaust fumes. Inside the Rusty Skillet diner, the air conditioning unit was fighting a losing battle, rattling violently as it spat lukewarm air over the vinyl booths. In the corner booth, facing the door, a habit born of a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, sat Hank Cobb. Known on the streets and within the club as Iron, Hank was the president of the local Hells Angels charter. At 45 years old, he was a mountain of a man. His arms, thick as oak tree trunks, were covered in faded, intricate ink that told stories of brotherhood, violence, and survival. He wore his leather cut like a second skin, the iconic winged death head patch dominating his back, a universal symbol of intimidation and outlaw freedom. Sitting with him were 3 of his most trusted brothers. Wyatt, a lean, wiry man with a long beard and cold blue eyes. Jesse, the club's sergeant-at-arms, built like a brick wall. And Bones, a younger, restless biker who was currently aggressively dismantling a plate of ribs. They were laughing, the low, gravelly sound of men who lived on the edge of society, sharing a rare moment of peace after a long, grueling ride from Nevada. The diner was relatively full. A few truckers, some tired locals, and a local deputy named Higgins, who was nursing a black coffee 2 stools down from the register. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon until the glass door groaned open. Hank's eyes instinctively flicked to the entrance. A child stood in the doorway. He was tiny, frail, and absolutely covered in dirt. His blonde hair was matted with sweat and grime, and his cheeks were streaked with fresh, glistening tears. But it was his left arm that made Hank's jaw clench. It was swollen to twice its normal size, bending slightly between the elbow and the wrist in a way that defied human anatomy. The boy was cradling it tightly to his chest, his entire little body trembling with shock and agony. The diner patrons' reactions were immediate but passive. A waitress dropped a handful of silverware into a plastic tub with a loud clatter. Deputy Higgins turned around, raised his eyebrows, but didn't immediately get off his stool. People whispered. People stared. Nobody moved. The boy, however, didn't look at the waitresses. He didn't look at the badge on Higgins' chest. His wide, terrified, tear-filled blue eyes scanned the room and locked instantly onto the imposing, terrifying figure of Hank Cobb. Slowly, dragging his worn-out sneakers across the linoleum, the 5-year-old bypassed the authorities and the civilians. He walked a straight line toward the Hells Angels booth. Wyatt stopped mid-sentence. Jesse slowly put down his fork. Bones sat up straight, the easygoing atmosphere instantly evaporating. The boy stopped inches from Hank's heavy steel-toed boots. Up close, Hank could see the dark purple bruising forming around the boy's jawline, the dried blood beneath his nostrils, and the sheer terror vibrating through his small frame. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the diner was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. You could hear the neon sign buzzing in the window. Hank leaned forward, the leather of his cut creaking loudly in the quiet room. He rested his massive, calloused hands on his knees, bringing his scarred face down to the boy's eye level. He didn't smile. He knew a fake smile would only terrify a wounded animal, but he softened his hardened eyes. "What's your name, little man?" Hank's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, surprisingly gentle for a man who looked like he could tear a truck in half. The boy sniffled, a violent shudder racking his body. "Toby!" he squeaked out, his voice hoarse from crying. "Okay, Toby," Hank said slowly, You look like you're hurting real bad. What happened to you? Toby looked at the massive patch on Hank's chest, tracing the lettering with his eyes before looking back up into Hank's face. My mommy told me. Toby's voice broke into a heartbreaking sob. She told me monsters wear black leather. She said, if I'm bad, the monsters will get me. Jesse shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Wyatt's eyes narrowed. Hank didn't flinch. Is that right? Well, your mommy is right about one thing. We are monsters, Toby, but we don't hurt kids. So, I'll ask you again. Who did this to you? Toby stepped closer, seeking refuge in the shadow of the giant. He leaned in and whispered the words that would alter the course of everyone's lives in that town. He broke my arm, Toby cried. Greg broke my arm because I spilled the juice. I need a monster to stop him, please. Hank Cobb closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the gentleness was gone, replaced by a terrifying, cold, calculating darkness. He didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch. He simply reached out and gently laid his massive hand on the boy's uninjured shoulder. All right, Toby, Hank said softly. You found your monster. The moment Hank stood up, the diner's atmosphere shifted from tense to volatile. Hank towered over the boy, his sheer mass blocking out the sunlight, filtering through the window. Wyatt, get a cold, wet towel, Hank barked, his voice no longer gentle but commanding, snapping the room out of its paralyzed trance. Jesse, pull the van around to the front. We aren't taking the bikes. The suspension is too rough for a broken bone. Deputy Higgins finally decided to intervene. He stepped off his stool, resting a hand casually on his duty belt, and sauntered over to the booth. Hold on a minute there, Cobb, Higgins said, projecting an authority he clearly didn't feel. You boys need to step back. This is a matter for law enforcement and child protective services. I'll take the boy from here. Hank slowly turned his head to look at the deputy. He didn't square up. He didn't need to. The look of pure, unadulterated contempt in the Hell's Angel's eyes was enough to make Higgins halt his advance. You've been sitting in this diner for an hour, Higgins, Hank said, his voice low and deadly quiet. This kid walks in, bleeding, shattered, and you didn't even get off your stool until you saw my colors. You think I'm handing him over to a system that let him get this way in the first place? It's the law, Hank, Higgins warned, his hand nervously tapping his radio. Don't complicate this. You take that boy. It's kidnapping. Wyatt returned with a cold, damp rag. Hank ignored the deputy entirely. He knelt back down, gently wiping the dried blood and grime from Toby's face. The boy leaned into the touch, starved for any semblance of care. Toby, Hank said softly, entirely ignoring the police officer standing 3 feet away. We're going to take you to a doctor, a friend of mine. He's going to fix your arm, and he's going to give you something for the pain. Are you okay with riding with me? Toby nodded vigorously, wrapping his good arm around Hank's thick leather vest. Hank stood up, lifting the 5-year-old with one arm effortlessly, being incredibly careful not to jostle the broken limb. He looked dead at Higgins. I'm taking him to Mercy General. If you want to arrest me for getting a dying kid to a hospital, Higgins, you go ahead and unclip those cuffs. But you better be ready to use whatever else is on that belt, because I ain't stopping. Higgins swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Hank, Wyatt, and Bones, who had quietly positioned himself between the deputy and the door. Higgins took a step back, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Just take him to the hospital, Cobb. I'll follow in the cruiser. Do whatever makes you feel like a man, Hank muttered, turning his back on the badge. Outside, the scorching heat hit them like a physical blow. Jesse had pulled the club's black customized chase van directly up to the diner's front doors, idling loudly. Hank climbed into the back, settling Toby gently onto the plush leather bench. Wyatt and Bones slid in after him, while Jesse slammed it into gear. The ride to Mercy General Hospital was a tense, quiet affair. Toby, exhausted by the adrenaline and the agonizing pain, rested his head against Hank's chest, his small, ragged breaths sinking with the deep rumble of the van's engine. Hank just stared out the window, his mind racing. Greg. Toby had said the name Greg. Hank knew the streets of Bakersfield better than the mayor. He knew the players, the dealers, the abusers, and the ghosts. There was a Greg Harmon, who lived out in the Sunland trailer park on the edge of the county line. A two-bit hustler who was known for running low-grade methamphetamine and using women as stepping stones. If that was the man who did this, the situation was far more complicated than a simple domestic dispute. Greg had ties. When they arrived at the emergency room, the automatic doors slid open to reveal chaos, but the chaos immediately parted when 4 Hells Angels walked in. Hank carried Toby directly to the triage desk. "I need a doctor right now," Hank told the pale triage nurse. "His arm is snapped, he's dehydrated, and he's in shock." "Sir? You need to fill out," the nurse started. "I don't need a clipboard, I need Dr. Evans. Page him. Tell him Iron is here, and he has a priority one." Within 3 minutes, a gray-haired doctor in a white coat came rushing through the double doors. "Doctor." Evans had patched up more bullet wounds, knife gashes, and road rash for the local MC than he cared to count. He took one look at Toby, then at Hank, and pointed to Trauma Room 3. They laid Toby on the bed. Dr. Evans carefully cut the dirty t-shirt away, revealing a torso painted in a horrifying mosaic of yellow, green, and purple bruises. Some were old, some were violently fresh. Hank's jaw locked so tight he thought his teeth might shatter. "Spiral fracture of the radius," Dr. Evans murmured, examining the arm. "This happens when a limb is forcefully twisted. It's a classic hallmark of severe physical abuse." "Hank, this is bad." "Fix him, Doc," Hank said coldly. "Give him the good stuff. Make sure he doesn't feel another ounce of pain." As the nurses began administering an IV and pain medication, Toby's eyes drooped. Before he went under the heavy sedation, he reached out his uninjured hand. Hank wrapped his massive fingers around the tiny, fragile hand. "You gonna go get the monster?" Toby slurred sleepily. Hank leaned in close, his voice a promise written in stone. "I'm gonna drag him out from under the bed, Toby. Sleep now." Hank stepped out of Trauma Room 3 into the sterile hallway. Wyatt, Jesse, and Bones were waiting, leaning against the pale blue walls, their expressions mirroring Hank's lethal intent. "Jesse," Hank said, pulling a heavy, custom-engraved Zippo lighter from his pocket and flipping it open and closed. "Get on the horn. Call the clubhouse. I want 20 brothers at the Sunland Trailer Park in 30 minutes. Wyatt, you stay here. You sit outside that door. And if anybody who isn't wearing scrubs tries to walk in, you break their legs." "What about the cops?" Wyatt asked, nodding toward the ER entrance where Deputy Higgins had just walked in, accompanied by 2 other officers. "Let the cops do the paperwork," Hank said, buttoning his leather cut, the silver clasps clicking ominously. "We're going to do the street work." The Sunland Trailer Park was a desolate graveyard of broken dreams and rusted metal, situated 10 miles outside the city limits where the desert started to reclaim the land. It was a place the local police only visited in pairs, a labyrinth of decaying mobile homes, aggressive chained dogs, and the pervasive, acrid smell of cooking chemicals. When Hank's black van pulled through the rusted chain-link gates, followed by a thunderous procession of 20 roaring Harley-Davidson motorcycles, the entire park seemed to hold its breath. Curtains twitched. Doors locked. The aggressive dogs stopped barking and whimpered, retreating into their doghouses. The Hells Angels had arrived, and they didn't come in these numbers unless a war was starting. Hank stepped out of the van, the crunch of the gravel under his boots echoing in the sudden, eerie silence as the bikers cut their engines in unison. "Trailer 44, Hank said softly. 20 men, clad in heavy leather, chains, and denim, formed a wedge behind their president. They walked down the dirt road with purposeful, terrifying synchronization. Trailer 44 was at the dead end of a dirt cul-de-sac. It was a faded, puke-green single-wide with aluminum foil taped over the windows and a rusted-out Camaro sitting on cinder blocks in the front yard. Hank didn't hesitate. He walked up the rickety wooden steps, which groaned under his immense weight, and didn't bother knocking. He raised his heavy steel-toed boot and kicked the cheap aluminum door precisely at the lock. The door exploded inward, tearing off its hinges and crashing onto the cheap linoleum floor inside. "What the hell?" a voice roared from the back bedroom. Hank stepped into the trailer. The air inside was foul, smelling of stale beer, body odor, and the unmistakable chemical tang of meth. Sitting on a stained velvet couch in the living room was a woman, Sarah, Toby's mother. She had a black eye, a split lip, and looked utterly terrified. She screamed and scrambled backward, pressing herself against the cheap paneled wall. Hank pointed a thick, leather-clad finger at her. "Stay down." Don't make a sound." From the narrow hallway, Greg Harmon emerged. He was a big man, maybe pushing 250 pounds, wearing only a dirty tank top and basketball shorts. He had tribal tattoos wrapping around his thick arms, the kind of guy who bullied people in dive bars and beat up those smaller than him. He held an aluminum baseball bat in his right hand. Greg stopped dead in his tracks. He expected the police, or maybe a rival dealer. He did not expect Hank Iron Cobb standing in his living room with a sea of Hell's Angels pouring into his yard and spilling onto his porch. "Who the—" Greg stammered, his false bravado immediately shattering. "You can't just bust in here. I know my rights. I know people." Hank walked slowly toward him. "You know people? That's good, Greg. It's always good to have friends." Greg tightened his grip on the bat, trying to mask his terror with anger. "Get out of my house, biker. You don't know who you're messing with. I run with the Reyes cartel out of Fresno, and I pay the sheriff's department $1,000 a week to look the other way. You touch me, you're dead men." It was a twist Hank hadn't fully anticipated, but it made perfect sense. It was why Higgins had been so dismissive at the diner. The local law was getting a cut of Greg's meth operation. Greg felt untouchable. He felt like a king in his filthy aluminum castle. Hank stopped 2 feet away from Greg. The sheer size difference, combined with Hank's overwhelming aura of violence, made Greg look like a frightened child. "The Reyes cartel," Hank repeated softly, "and the sheriff. My, Greg, you are a very important man." Suddenly, with a speed that defied his massive frame, Hank reached out. He didn't punch Greg. He simply clamped his left hand around Greg's throat. The grip was like an industrial vice. Greg dropped the bat with a clatter and grabbed at Hank's arm, his eyes bulging as his airway was instantly crushed. Hank lifted him. He literally lifted the 250-pound man until Greg's bare feet dangled an inch off the floor. "But here's the problem, Greg," Hank whispered, leaning in so close that Greg could see the individual scars on Hank's face. "The sheriff doesn't run this state. The cartel doesn't run this county. We do." Hank effortlessly slammed Greg backward against the paneled wall. The trailer shook violently. Pictures fell off the walls. "You broke a 5-year-old boy's arm today," Hank said, his voice void of any emotion, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Over spilled juice. Sarah, still huddled on the floor, began to sob hysterically. "He wouldn't let me leave. He said he'd kill me and Toby. He has the cops in his pocket. I couldn't go to them." Hank didn't look at her. He kept his dead eyes locked on the purple, oxygen-starved face of Greg Harmon. "I'm not going to kill you, Greg," Hank stated. "Killing you is easy. It's quick. And honestly, it's too good for a man who snaps a child's bones." Hank let go. Greg collapsed to the floor, gasping and hacking violently, desperately pulling air into his bruised windpipe. Hank looked back toward the doorway. "Jesse, Bones, come here." The 2 massive bikers stepped into the cramped trailer. "Toby told me his arm was broken," Hank said conversationally, looking down at the pathetic, wheezing man on the floor. "And the Bible says an eye for an eye. But I'm not a religious man, Greg. I'm an outlaw. And in my world, the interest rates are a bitch." Greg looked up, pure, unadulterated horror dawning in his eyes as he realized what was about to happen. He tried to scramble backward, kicking his legs, but Jesse stepped forward and planted a heavy boot squarely on Greg's chest, pinning him to the floor. "Hold his right arm out," Hank ordered coldly. Bones grabbed Greg's right wrist and wrenched it outward, pinning it flat against the linoleum. Greg began to scream, a high-pitched, desperate sound that echoed out of the trailer and into the silent park, where 20 Hell's Angels stood like statues, indifferent to the suffering of a monster. Wait, please," Greg begged, tears streaming down his face. "I have money. I have product. Take it all." Hank knelt beside him. "I don't want your money. I don't want your poison." Hank stood up, raising his heavy, steel-toed motorcycle boot. "This is from Toby," Hank whispered. He brought his boot down with the force of a sledgehammer directly onto Greg's right forearm. The sickening crack of bone snapping echoed through the trailer, instantly followed by an agonizing shriek that tore Greg's vocal cords. Greg writhed in pure agony, his right arm now bent at a horrific, unnatural angle. mirroring the exact injury he had inflicted on the child. But Hank wasn't done. He looked down at the sobbing, broken man. "Hold his left arm out," Hank said. Greg's eyes rolled back in his head. "No. Please, God, no. We're even. You broke it. We're even." "Like I said," Hank replied, raising his boot again, his face a mask of stone. "Interest rates." Another sickening crack. Another blood-curdling scream. Both of Greg Harmon's arms were now useless, shattered beyond simple repair. Hank casually adjusted his leather cut and looked over at Sarah, who was staring in absolute shock, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. "Pack a bag," Hank told her, his voice returning to a normal, conversational volume. "You have 5 minutes. You and the boy are leaving this state. You're going to stay with my sister in Oregon until this blows over. The cartel won't look for you there, and Higgins won't be able to touch you." Sarah nodded frantically, scrambling to her feet and running toward the back bedroom to gather whatever she could carry. Hank crouched down one last time next to Greg, who was whimpering in a puddle of his own making, unable to even clutch his shattered limbs. "Listen to me very carefully," Hank whispered into Greg's ear. "When the corrupt sheriff gets here, you're going to tell him that a rival dealer did this to you. If you mention my name, if you mention my club, or if you ever try to find that boy and his mother, I will come back. And next time, I won't be breaking bones. I'll be pulling them out." Hank stood up, turned his back on the broken monster, and walked out into the scorching California sun. The immediate aftermath of the incident at the Sunland Trailer Park was a masterclass in organized silence. The local hospital treated Greg Harmon for catastrophic bilateral spiral fractures. When Deputy Higgins arrived to take the official statement, Greg, sweating profusely and heavily medicated, stuck perfectly to the script Hank had burned into his mind. He blamed a masked group of rival dealers from out of town. He didn't say a word about the Hells Angels, the 5-year-old boy, or the massive biker who had snapped his bones like dry twigs. But the underworld is a living, breathing organism, and it talks. 72 hours later, the Bakersfield heat wave finally broke, replaced by a suffocating, low-hanging smog. Hank Cobb was in the back room of the Hells Angels clubhouse, wiping grease off his hands with a heavy shop towel. The clubhouse was a fortress-reinforced steel doors, blackout windows, and a perimeter guarded by armed prospects around the clock. Jesse pushed open the heavy oak door to Hank's office, his face grim. "Iron. We got a problem." The Rays cartel didn't buy Greg's story about out-of-towners. They sent a crew up from Fresno. "They're sitting at the edge of our territory, at the abandoned rail yard on Route 9. They sent a messenger. They want a sit-down. Now." Hank threw the greasy towel onto his desk. He knew this was the inevitable complication. Greg Harmon might have been a low-level piece of trash, but he was moving cartel product, and the cartel didn't tolerate disruptions to their cash flow. "Tell Wyatt and Bones to fire up their bikes," Hank rumbled, grabbing his leather cut from the back of his chair. "We don't keep the devil waiting." The abandoned rail yard was a graveyard of rusted boxcars and overgrown weeds. When Hank, Jesse, Wyatt, and Bones rolled in, the thunder of their V-twin engines echoed off the metal husks. Parked in a deliberate, tactical semicircle were 3 blacked-out SUVs. Standing in front of them, flanked by heavily armed men holding compact automatic rifles, was Hector Chavez. Hector was a cartel lieutenant known for his brutal efficiency, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in the dirt and grime of the rail yard. He watched calmly as the 4 Hells Angels parked their bikes and dismounted. Hank walked forward, his massive frame towering over the impeccably dressed enforcer. He didn't bring 20 men this time. Bringing an army to a sit-down was a sign of fear. Bringing 3 of your most lethal brothers was a sign of absolute confidence. "Hank Cobb," Hector said, his voice smooth, carrying a faint accent. "Or do you prefer iron?" "Hank is fine," he replied, stopping 10 feet away. "You're a long way from Fresno, Hector." "Business brings me here," Hector said, pulling a silver cigarette case from his jacket. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up into the stagnant air. "You broke one of my best distributors." Both of his arms. "My product is sitting in a trailer, unmoving. My money is delayed. The Reyes family views this as an act of disrespect. Greg Harmon beat a 5-year-old boy and snapped his arm over spilled juice, Hank said, his voice flat, devoid of intimidation or apology. He broke the rules of the street. Women and kids are off limits. I handled it. Hector sighed, blowing a stream of smoke. Morality is a luxury, Hank. We deal in commerce. You disrupted commerce over a personal vendetta. The penalty for that is steep. You owe the Reyes family $200,000 in lost revenue, and we want it by Friday. If not, this town turns into a war zone. The cartel enforcers behind Hector shifted, their hands tightening on their rifles. Jesse and Wyatt imperceptibly adjusted their stances, ready to draw the heavy-caliber pistols holstered beneath their cuts. Hank didn't blink. He reached into the deep inner pocket of his leather vest. Instantly, the cartel guns raised, aiming directly at Hank's chest. "Easy," Hank growled, slowly pulling his hand out. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a small, black, leather-bound notebook. Before we left Greg's trailer, while the boy's mother was packing her bags, I took a look around. Found this taped to the bottom of the toilet tank. Hank tossed the notebook into the dirt at Hector's expensive Italian leather shoes. "What is this?" Hector asked, narrowing his eyes. "That," Hank said, "is Greg Harmon's personal ledger. I spent the last 3 days reading it." "You're right, Hector. We deal in commerce. And according to those numbers, Greg has been stepping on your product, diluting it, and skimming 20% off the top for the last 2 years." Hector's expression remained perfectly neutral, but his eyes flicked down to the book. "But that's not the best part," Hank continued, taking a step closer. "He wasn't doing it alone. He's been splitting the skimmed profits with Sheriff Harding and Deputy Higgins to keep the local heat off him. Your distributor wasn't just a child abuser, Hector. He was a thief, and he was using the local cops to rob the Reyes family blind." Silence descended on the rail yard, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Hector slowly knelt, picked up the notebook, and flipped through the handwritten pages. His eyes scanned the columns of dates, weights, and dollar amounts. The anger that flashed across his face was momentary, but it was lethal. Hector closed the book and slipped it into his suit pocket. He looked up at Hank, a new understanding passing between the two men. "It seems," Hector said quietly, "that there has been a misunderstanding. You didn't disrupt our commerce, Hank. You uncovered a leak. For that, the Reyes family owes you a debt of gratitude." "I don't want your gratitude," Hank said, turning back toward his motorcycle. "I want you out of my town, and I want an understanding that the woman and the boy are completely off limits." "You have my word," Hector said, flicking his cigarette into the dirt. "Greg Harmon will be dealt with when he gets out of the hospital. And as for Sheriff Harding and his deputy, I believe they are about to experience a very sudden, very tragic lapse in their job security." Hank swung his heavy leg over his bike and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life. He had played his hand perfectly. The Hells Angels were clear, the child abuser was ruined, and the corrupt cops were about to face a justice far worse than anything internal affairs could ever deliver. A week later, the local Bakersfield News reported the mysterious disappearance of Sheriff Harding and Deputy Higgins. Their cruisers were found abandoned near the county line. The FBI was called in, but the streets knew the truth. The cartel had balanced its books. 8 months passed. The blistering California summer bled into a mild winter, and then into a vibrant spring. Down in Bakersfield, the Hells Angels charter continued to ride, govern their territory, and live outside the lines of conventional society. But for Hank Iron Cobb, a piece of his mind was always firmly anchored 3 states away. It was late May when Hank called a special run. He didn't announce the destination to the full charter, only to his inner circle, Jesse, Wyatt, and Bones. They packed light, strapped their gear to their customized choppers, and hit the Pacific Coast Highway, leaving the desert behind for the towering redwoods and misty coastlines of the north. They rode for 3 days, the thunder of their pipes cutting through the fog, until they crossed into Oregon. Brenda's farm sat at the end of a long, winding gravel driveway in the Willamette Valley. Hank's sister was a tough, no-nonsense woman who had traded the biker lifestyle of her youth for 30 acres of apple orchards and a quiet life. When the 4 massive Harleys crunched up the driveway, turning off their engines by the wraparound porch, the silence of the country wrapped around them. Hank kicked down his kickstand and took off his helmet, running a hand through his graying hair. He looked toward the sprawling green lawn. Sitting in the grass, playing with a rusted toy dump truck, was Toby. He was almost 6 years old now. The dirt, the grime, and the terror that had clung to him in the rusty skillet diner were completely gone. He had filled out, his cheeks rosy from the Oregon air, his blonde hair cut neat. And most importantly, he was using both of his arms perfectly, scooping up handfuls of dirt and loading them into his toy truck. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked healthier, the heavy bags under her eyes replaced by the bright spark of someone who no longer had to sleep with one eye open. When she saw the leather cuts and the winged death heads, she didn't flinch. She smiled, tears instantly springing to her eyes. "Toby!" Sarah called out, her voice trembling with emotion. "Look who's here!" The boy dropped his toy and stood up. He squinted against the afternoon sun, looking at the 4 giant, scarred men standing in his front yard. For a second, he hesitated. Then, recognition washed over his face. "The monsters!" Toby yelled, his voice echoing with pure, unfiltered joy. He didn't walk, he sprinted. He ran across the grass as fast as his little legs could carry him and launched himself directly at Hank. Hank caught the boy mid-air, wrapping his massive, heavily tattooed arms around him, lifting him high into the air. "Look at you, little man," Hank laughed, a deep rumbling sound that surprised even his own club brothers. "You got big. How's that arm?" "It's like titanium," Toby announced proudly, holding out his left arm and flexing a tiny imaginary bicep. "Dr. Evans fixed it, just like you said." Wyatt, the stone-cold enforcer, actually cracked a genuine smile. Bones knelt down in the grass to inspect the toy dump truck, and Jesse tipped his sunglasses down to hide the moisture welling in his eyes. Hank set Toby down but kept a heavy, protective hand on his shoulder. Sarah walked down the porch steps and threw her arms around Hank, hugging him tightly. "We read the news about Bakersfield," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "About Greg. About the sheriff. I don't know what you did, Hank, but thank you. You gave us our lives back." "I just took out the trash, Sarah," Hank replied softly. "You did the hard part. You built a home for him." Hank stepped back and looked at Toby. "Hey, kid, I brought you something." Hank walked over to his bike and unstrapped a small leather saddlebag. He opened it and pulled out a piece of clothing. It was a miniature black leather vest, custom-tailored to fit a 6-year-old boy. On the back, there was no outlaw patch. Hank wouldn't put that target on a kid's back. But beautifully stitched in silver thread across the shoulders were the words, "Little Brother," and on the front, over the heart, a small patch that read, "Protected by Bakersfield." Hank knelt in the grass and held the vest out. Toby's eyes went wide. He carefully slipped his arms into the leather, looking down at the patches in awe. "You told me once that your mommy said monsters wear black leather," Hank said, looking Toby dead in the eye, his voice low and serious. "Well, sometimes the world is full of bad men, Toby. Men who hurt people smaller than them. And the only thing those bad men are afraid of are bigger, meaner monsters." Hank tapped the patch over Toby's heart. "You what's this?" Hank told him. "And you remember that no matter where you go, no matter how old you get, you have an army of monsters watching your back. Nobody will ever hurt you again. You understand me?" Toby nodded fiercely, puffing out his small chest, the heavy leather making him look like the toughest kid in the Willamette Valley. "I understand, Hank." That night, the Hells Angels didn't drink whiskey in a dive bar or break bones in a trailer park. They sat around a fire pit on an Oregon farm, eating homemade apple pie, listening to a little boy talk about his favorite bugs, and laughing under a blanket of stars. The world would always see Hank Iron Cobb and his brothers as dangerous outlaws, menaces to polite society, and harbingers of violence. And in many ways, they were. But justice is a complicated, messy thing. Sometimes it's blind, sometimes it's corrupt, and sometimes, when the system fails entirely, true justice rolls into town on 2 wheels, wearing black leather, ready to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The epic conclusion to Toby and Hank's story is a powerful reminder that heroes rarely come in shining armor. Sometimes they arrive in black leather, riding heavy machinery. Hank Iron Cobb and his brothers risk their club, their freedom, and their lives to pull a broken child out of the darkest circumstances imaginable, proving that true brotherhood extends to protecting the innocent. When the corrupt system turned a blind eye, these outlaws became the ultimate shield. If this incredible journey of street justice, cartel standoffs, and found family gave you chills, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button to show respect for the real protectors out there, share this video to remind the world that child abuse will never be tolerated, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, real-life stories that redefine what it means to be a hero. Drop a comment below what was your favorite moment of the story. Let's hear it.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of King's Obsession Concord. After watching the video, he broke my arm. A 5-year-old cried to a Hell's Angel. His next move shocked everyone. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the instinct to protect someone who was vulnerable. Beyond the drama, the story felt like it was really about standing up for those who can't always stand up for themselves. It's easy to judge people by their appearance or reputation, but sometimes the strongest sense of compassion comes from the people others least expect. Do you think courage is more about physical strength or about choosing to do the right thing when someone needs help? And have you ever witnessed a moment when a person completely changed your opinion of them through their actions? Stories like this remind me that kindness, responsibility, and looking out for others can leave a lasting impact. If this story gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt biker stories about protection, loyalty, and unexpected acts of compassion, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.